Their profiles and link to some of their work on our website, www.onlinelearninglegends.com. I'm Mark Nichols, the interviewer in this episode. You'll meet Associate Professor Aras Bozkurt in this episode. Aras is Associate Professor of Distance Education with Anadolu University in Turkey, with an international scholarship in distance education and blended learning. Listen out for 4 periods of online education and applications of online learning based on distance education theory. It's my pleasure to be talking with Aras Bozkurt, who is Associate Professor of Distance Education with Anadolu University in Turkey. Aras is an international scholar in distance education and blended learning and is an executive editor of the Asian Journal of Distance Education. Great to be talking with you, Aras.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be a part of the leaders and legends of the online learning community.
Can we start with a brief overview of your career and publications?
As a matter of fact, I never imagined a career in academia, but here I am. I was really a good lifelong learner, still a good one, and that being so somehow introduced me to the field of distance education. Here in Turkey, distance education has a long tradition, and I remember that I was watching lectures on a TV named TRT4 as a part of Anadolu University Open Education Faculty. Interestingly, once watching these lectures with interest, I am currently working as a researcher and faculty member at the same institution. I always believed that our experiences define us, and I also strongly advocate that if you want to learn swimming, you should go into the sea, you should get wet and feel the water surrounding you. In this sense, I believe that if I work on distance education, I should experience it not only as a researcher, but also as a student. I had to be an insider. Therefore, after graduating from university, I got a second high school degree, which was delivered as an open and distance learning program. And I also got another undergraduate degree from the Open Education Faculty of Anadolu University. Of course, my earlier distance education experiences as an insider were not intentional, but I see that these experiences somehow guided me throughout my career. Before working at academia, at university, I was a language teacher, and I worked for several years, but the passion to research motivated me to change my career. Once my friend told me that there is a MA program here at Anadolu University on distance education, and when I heard that program for the first time, I told myself, that is the one I was looking for. And once a student at this program, now I teach and research at the same program, and I really feel fortunate to be a part of it. When it comes to my research, I see that both my personal traits and my early experiences in open, online and distance education are reflected in my research. I believe that networks, more specifically online networks, are really powerful, and therefore during my PhD I studied changing learner and instructor roles in online network spaces. It was a mixed methods research, and social network analysis was one of the analytical approaches I used. Assuming that learning is social, I liked seeing and investigating online learning from the perspective of learning ecosystems, and again, social network analysis was really helpful to me. And now many of my publications use networking and ecosystem views as a lens to interpret my findings. Again, I realized that networks are everywhere, including the research papers. When we intentionally write a title, use keywords, and describe our work with a limited number of words in the abstract, in fact, we create a lexical network. When we cite other references and when our works are being cited by other papers, they create an intellectual network. Then I started to research the research. Many of my recent publications now use data mining and analytical approaches such as text mining, sentiment analysis, or social network analysis. One of the latest examples of such a publication is Intellectual Roots of Distance Education, a progressive knowledge domain analysis published at Distance Education, and another one is Trends and Patterns in Distance Education, a synthesis of scholarly publications and visualization of the intellectual landscape published at Eurodeal. I also would like to note that I recently started adding Easter eggs, hidden messages, and metaphors to the editorials I have written. I mean, some of my publications include more than critical, so-called critical ideas, but they also offer many mysteries to unlock. For instance, the latest editorial entitled Digital Transformation and the Way We Misinterpret Technology, and the previous one, which is entitled In Pursuit of the Right Mix, Blended Learning for Augmenting, Enhancing, and Enriching Flexibility, are worth exploring if you want to find interesting things in the intellectual mazes. As you see, my career has a lot of footprints going back to my past, and my publications are actually a way for me to express myself and my professional identity.
I really like that. The publications are a way of expressing yourself and your professional identity. So there's been a lot of research publications that you've published over the last few years. What are some of the key themes and key ideas that your work has provided that you think are particularly pertinent today?
To me, educational technology and distance education, when I say distance education, I also refer, e-learning, online learning, etc.
Yeah.
These fields are converging. They are not two separate things. And the field of distance education and probably other fields are being more interdisciplinary. This is one of the observation. And in a general sense, my publications have a lot of references to ideas of online learning ecosystems in which I see learning not an isolated process, but as an interconnected process to the entire social systems we engage in. I see that before COVID-19 pandemic, this idea has captured a lot of attention due to capacity increase in online networks and what they promise in terms of teaching and learning. And I frequently use social network analysis to capture, report, map, and visualize learner behaviors in networked online learning spaces. I find social network analysis very useful because it provides me more real user data than biased self-reported data that can be collected through online surveys or scales. In terms of methodological approaches, I see that, the approaches I use also gaining more attention recently. I observed that traditional methodological paradigms are, in some cases, incapable of understanding the complexity of today's online learning ecosystems, and I see that many data mining and analytical approaches are being adopted more and more. Besides, I always believe that there is a shadow war between quantitative and qualitative research paradigms. And this shadow war is getting to an end. Researchers and many journals now value both research paradigms, both qualitative and quantitative. And I also see that due to online learning and online spaces, people are encouraged to use new innovative research techniques such as social network analysis. In short, I focused on networked learning and online learning ecosystems, and I see that these notions are widely adopted, especially in recent years, both as a topic and innovative methodological paradigms.
I want to just probe you a little bit. You've used the terms distance education, online learning, e-learning, and of course you've also published in blended learning. How do you tell those terms apart? What are the differences that you discern across them?
It is really difficult to give you an exact definition because I see that, for example, distance education or open and online learning. These terms are contextualized according to the cultural backgrounds, social backgrounds, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So what I define probably wouldn't fit, for some people in some part of the world. So it's really challenging. But, in a general sense, I see distance education as a generic umbrella term, and because of the emerging needs and emerging technologies, I see that new terms are emerging, like online learning, e-learning, mobile learning, u-learning, ubiquitous learning, open and distributed learning. I mean, there are a lot of terms, but the generic term is, to me, distance education.
So it's now heading towards late 2022. We've come through 2 years, possibly 3 now, of COVID-19, a lot of change in the education sector. What are your observations about online learning and education at the moment?
It will be a bit historical, but my observations about online learning can be narrated in 4 characteristic periods. The first period, I have to tell this to give you the background. The first period is the 1990s. During that time, distance education was approached with caution. We see many meta-analyses conducted that time to prove the effectiveness of distance education. People were skeptical against online distance education, and this can be easily identified in research trends and patterns. The second period is the decade between 2000 and 2010. By the beginning of the 2000s, online technologies have become widespread, which paved the way for online learning and is being part of the mainstream education. The third period, I'm getting closer to today. The third period covers between 2010 and the time until COVID-19 hit us. During the third period, I think we all witnessed that educational technologies are used to level up online learning. We had high bandwidth internet, high computing power, and many technological tools such as smartphones, which became available for many and allowed us to connect from anywhere, anytime. This is really important. We forged online learning pedagogies and conducted many experimental research during this period. However, one thing that bothers me for the third period is blindly adopting educational technologies and arguing that each new technology will save education.
Yeah.
In fact, many educators tend to believe that innovative technologies are the savior descending from the sky, and they blindly follow popular discourses that these technologies would transform the entire educational system. I think, this type of researchers will always be among us, and to avoid from such misconceptions, we should simply remember that technology is not an end, but rather a means. I think we should not reduce technology-driven approaches in a single dimension. In contrast, we should have a multidimensional perspective, which might include social, cultural, pedagogical, and other critical variables that are necessary. And, when it comes to your question, the final period refers to the time that COVID-19 pandemic knocked our doors. Can you imagine that, during the high COVID times, when the first waves hit the entire globe, the pandemic introduced us a strange new world where to be social means to keep distance, and weirdly and interestingly, to be labeled positive has negative connotations. I mean, as a global society, we were then introduced with the term new normal, where emergency remote teaching and learning mostly applied across the world.
Yeah.
The issue that bothers me for the COVID-19 and probably for the post-COVID time is that many people assumed that online learning and emergence remote teaching and learning are the same thing, though they were two different things. Looking back to the past 2 years, I believe that the pandemic was a great reset, and it will have many consequences in the short and long term. And perhaps in such a critical time, our efforts to advocate and explain online learning was not enough, because I see that many people still, refer what happened during the pandemic. I mean, they label it, they brand it as online learning, and this is actually bad for the reputation of the effective and planned practices. Mm-hmm. During the pandemic, I believe we had many educational sins, as seen in the failure of copying traditional face-to-face education and pasting it to online education, and then arguing, oh, it's not working. We never assume that it will work if we design a learning process in that way. The pandemic also introduced new terms such as digital fatigue and burnout, and reminded us digital divide is still a global problem. The pandemic also provided an opportunity to see higher education naked. As we started wearing masks, the real features of higher education have been unmasked, and we could now see higher education with no clothes to cover its faults. And the pandemic taught us that it is high time for higher education to renew, recalibrate, and maybe reposition itself in the emerging educational landscape, in the so-called new normal. However, such a notion would require that the institution of higher education, if it wants to regenerate itself and be born again, like the phoenix, it needs to rise from the ashes. But to do this, it must first face the flames, and perhaps it is also time for online learning researchers and designers to face the flames, because in the future, these times will be really remarkable, and the way we position ourselves will define our future. So how we position and how we contextualize ourselves is really important and critical. In brief, these periods also show us that online learning is a dynamic field, and we should constantly research to better understand the changing nature and possibilities that emerge with online technologies.
I'm going to question you a bit there, because you've raised a fascinating thought. What would a recalibrated education system look like? So you've talked about facing the flames and having an opportunity to regenerate what universities might do, how education might take place. Do you have a vision there of what that might look like?
This is my personal observation, but yeah, I see that the entire educational system, especially the higher education system, is being more quantified. University rankings, the number of publications, the fees required from the students, etc. All are linked to quantified values. And if we want to reposition, recalibrate higher education, we can start by prioritizing the pedagogy of care, humanizing the learning processes, and maybe providing different entry points to ensure equality and social justice in the educational landscape. Even these simple steps would change many things, and unfortunately we always talk about these terms, but we just talk. We need something in practice. We need to take action immediately if we want to see the results.
So in emergency remote teaching, it's almost like we took face-to-face and did it through Zoom. So distance education classically will look a bit different, perhaps with pre-developed materials clear study patterns, all those sorts of things?
We know that during the pandemic, people just lectured in front of the screens, and in many times, students are not allowed to turn on their cameras and microphones, or they intentionally didn't turn them on. If they are doing in that way, that means during the normal times before the pandemic, during the on-site face-to-face education, they were just lecturing. There is no collaboration, inclusion, etc. This was kind of a reflection of the past experiences. And, I told you during the pandemic, we have seen the higher education system naked. I was meaning that. Actually, there are a lot of lessons to learn from the pandemic experience. And I think most of the world failed in delivering a good educational process.
Yeah. So what do you think should have been done? As a distance educator, you teach differently than an emergency remote teacher. So what are some of those differences? What is it that makes distance education so different from emergency remote teaching?
The biggest difference between emergency remote teaching and learning and planned distance education or online learning, one is optional and the other one is obligation. And if you are forced to do learning delivery system that you are not motivated, expectedly you cannot get good results. I always, argue that online learning is one thing, on-site face-to-face learning is another thing. But, these are optional things. You cannot force people to learn throughout one of these modalities. And during the pandemic, one of the mistakes we did was forcing people. I think we just overdosed them with many online things, and that was the biggest difference.
So Aras, a hard question, I'm sure. The research you'd most like to see, if you could apply yourself to any research question and have a fairly healthy budget, what would you research? What would you look into?
I would like to talk about 3 lines of research. The first one is needed to better understand online distance education and to build upon its theoretical pillars. Probably, these topics would be pedagogy of care, emotional presence, and transactional distance. However, I would like to give a special emphasis on transactional distance because I believe that the way we define transactional distance evolves in time. Transactional distance is usually referred to as communication and psychological distance, and as the online technologies advance, the way we communicate and our psychological perception transforms. For instance, considering social media highly influenced transactional distance, and it is not the same term as it appeared decades ago. Therefore, I believe that we need to revisit transactional distance from time to time to update its definition and our perception. The second one would focus on online learning from the perspective of social dimension. These topics would be digital identity building and online community formation. I can also add networked learning to this group with a special emphasis on theoretical research. As argued years ago, online interactions are now beyond asking questions and replying them in the discussion forums. And our social presence in online learning spaces and the way we are perceived as real is higher when compared to the technologies used 1 or 2 decades ago. Besides, for many individuals, online networking is an integrated part of their lives, and I can really argue that the borders between virtual online and physical offline worlds are blurring. We hear that saying in many articles, but it's happening now. I'm very sure about that. So I believe that networked learning has still much to explore. The third line of research is about trending hot topics. These topics would be blended hybrid learning, learning analytics, micro-credentials, and artificial intelligence. Blended learning has a lot of potential for those who want to benefit from the strengths of online and on-site learning. Learning analytics offer more than statistically significant differences and provide us deeper insights regarding the learning processes in online spaces. Micro-credentials, I think it's really important because micro-credentials allow recognition of prior learning, meet the increasing demands from the business sector, and finally, micro-credentials are a way to update higher education system because the way it designed curriculum is much different than we apply now. When it comes to artificial intelligence, I think the future is there, yet with many applications we see now, I think it is still an emerging technology and we need to be proactive to really benefit from it without being techno-fetish. And I think researchers can study ethics in artificial intelligence because I believe, it will be a huge part of our learning processes in the future. And they can also explore the adaptive, personalized learning opportunities it offers. A final remark, not only as a researcher and faculty member, but as an editor, would be the research that I don't want to invest in. I don't want to see anymore. I am tired of seeing people, they still compare and contrast virtual online education and face-to-face on-site education. They are not the same things to compare. Both have strengths and limitations. We have to adopt when they best serve for the benefits of the learners, or we can adopt blended learning to increase our flexibility. We don't need to choose one side. In contrast, we need to be pragmatic and use what is working best for teaching and learning purposes.
Yeah, well said. It's good to see your distance education history coming through there too with Michael Moore's transactional distance.
True.
And also too, I think your second research area picked up on the community of inquiry. Yes, there's some deep theory that's underpinning those questions. Aras, two people you'd recommend as legends of online learning, one whose work or perspective is significantly influencing you now, and one who you think otherwise might have an important perspective to share.
Actually, there are many names on my list, but I will just go to the past. And I think I am heavily influenced by the works of Dave Cormier, George Siemens, Terry Anderson, and John Duran. I remember the first time I read Connectivism by George Siemens, and I said, yes, that's it. That's it. And when I read about rhizomatic learning by Dave Cormier, I said, wow, he's talking about my learning process. It's me, it's me in that story.
Yeah.
And I was reading Terry Anderson and John Duran's publications like poetry, I really enjoyed reading them. If I have to suggest two names, they would be Ramesh Sharma and John Duran. I'm not sure if they are featured. Ramesh Sharma, who is from India, he is an influential voice in the Asian region, and John Duran from Canada still writes very poetically and inspires me a lot. Probably these two names would be these brilliant scholars.
Oh, Aras, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I've learned a lot over our interview. Thank you so much for being a leader and legend of online learning.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to introduce my thoughts.
Mutual pleasure. Thank you. You can learn more about Aras and his work from our website. That concludes this episode. Be sure to go to our website www.onlinelearninglegends.com to follow up on this episode's guest. You'll also find links to others whose ideas continue.